You're listening to Seattle Real Estate Podcast.
Hey everybody, I'm Sean Reynolds, the owner of Summit Properties Northwest, Reynolds & Klein Appraisal, and your host of the Seattle Real Estate Podcast. So here in the state of Washington, we've had this ongoing tenant eviction moratorium going on. And we had that started right at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak. That was like February 28th or 29th. It got extended once, and then that just got extended again. And so the current moratorium went through June 4th. Today we are June the 3rd. And so now we've got an extension until August 1. So the current conditions still apply for most of this stuff, but we're going to get into some of the new criteria for the current eviction moratorium. So let's jump on in. All right, I am reading, for those of you who are not looking on the YouTube channel, who are downloading the podcast, I am referencing an article in The Stranger, a local Seattle news publication, and it indicates, as expected on Tuesday, Governor Jay Inslee, and Tuesday is yesterday, June the 2nd, Tuesday, Governor Jay Inslee extended the statewide eviction moratorium through August the 1st of 2020 throughout the state of Washington. The new proclamation maintains key features of the previous order, which banned all residential evictions for failure to pay rent, prohibited landlords from charging late fees on missed rent, and froze residential and some commercial rent hikes. People living in cars and renting out parcels or living in transitional housing such as hotels, motels, Airbnbs, and camping grounds will also still be covered. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump right over to the actual Washington Governor Jay Inslee website and read directly from the site what this moratorium looks like. So we know that Governor Inslee changed as of yesterday what that looks like. The governor first proclaimed a moratorium on evictions in mid-March, then extended and expanded the moratorium in mid-April. And the Proclamation 20-19 extends the prior eviction moratorium for 60 days through August the 1st. And I believe even after August the 1st, there's an automatic extension of another, I think it's 6 months, another 180 days. So tenants in the state of Washington are covered for quite a while. But we'll get into that here. Proclamation 2019 extends the prior eviction moratorium for 60 days through August the 1st and makes modifications to the prior moratorium. The modifications include, but are not limited to, first thing you got is prohibiting retaliation against any tenant who invokes rights or protection under the proclamation. So if you're a tenant and you are invoking, hey, my landlord isn't doing what he's supposed to per the current eviction moratorium, then the landlord can't retaliate. How that's going to be enforced, I'm not sure. The second thing is permitting eviction based on property damage, except for damage that is not urgent in nature, including conditions that were known or knowable to the landlord prior to the COVID-19 crisis. So the landlord can't boot out a tenant for damage to the property that was known prior to the crisis. And if it's not urgent in nature, can't boot out a tenant or start the process for that either. The third thing that this new moratorium covers is establishing a defense to any lawsuit for tenants if a landlord fails to offer a reasonable repayment plan. Now, everything I've seen in the media has quotes around the word reasonable. So what is a reasonable repayment plan? Probably going to have to go to court to figure that out, and that's super expensive. But that's the wording as of right now. If your landlord doesn't offer you a reasonable repayment plan, you may have some recourse, or you may have a defense to not being booted out. All right, establishing a minimum, this is the fourth item, establishing a minimum of a 14-day length of stay at hotel, motel, or any other non-traditional dwelling situation in order to trigger the application of the rights of this proclamation to the dwelling situation. So if you're in a short-term rental situation, you have to be there for at least 2 weeks, got to be there for 14 days before this kicks in. So obviously there's been some issues where somebody's been there 3 or 4 days, consider themselves a tenant and invoke this rent moratorium, and that is not the case. Got to go for at least 14 days, 2 weeks. The fifth item is allowing owners to evict tenants if the owner plans to occupy or sell the property after providing at least 60 days notice. All right, so you're having some troubles with your tenants, you give them 60 days notice, and you intend to sell the property. That's how you're going to get your tenants out if you're a landlord, and if that's the case. I don't know how they're going to enforce if you plan to do those items. That's a tough one. But there has to be some provisions for landlords who do indeed want to sell their property, and this is how they're going to do it. You have to give 60 days notice, and then you go from there. The sixth item is exempting commercial property rent increases that were executed in a rental agreement prior to the date the state of emergency was declared on February 29th. There we go, February 29th. So if something was in place, commercial, on a commercial lease, as far as a rent increase, maybe you've got automatic rent increases in your commercial lease, this exempts that from being under the eviction moratorium. Other restrictions, including the prohibition on assessing late fees or other charges, are continued in this order. So everything else that wasn't covered pretty much stays the same. Now so that's kind of the nuts and bolts of the new eviction moratorium that gets extended through August 1. Let's jump back to the Stranger article, and we're going to kind of keep reading, because I think there's some really good information in here that I don't necessarily agree with, but I think it brings up some good points, and I want to go through that. The Stranger article is basically saying there are, however, a few modifications in this new order. Some apparent concessions to landlords. The new modification allows landlords to evict for property damage, except for damage that is not as urgent in nature. We already read that. And we read through a couple of other things. Some good news for tenants. The new version of the order gives tenants a legal defense against landlords who fail to offer, and they put it in quote, reasonable repayment plans if tenants are unable to pay rent, and prohibits landlords from retaliating against tenants for tapping any of these protections. And here's an example of where that went into action. So far, Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson has successfully sued one Nevada-based landlord for violating Inslee's eviction moratorium, returning almost $300,000 directly to tenants in the form of refunds, payments, and rent forgiveness, according to the Seattle Times. That's got to be a ton of rental units in one project, something like that. I'm not aware of that case, but $300,000, that's a big apartment complex or a really big landlord with a lot of rental units that I haven't heard of. Housing Justice Project Managing Attorney Edmund Witter applauded the extension, but noted a few items of concern. We're still kind of talking about the extension of the moratorium here. In his view, absent clearer language, courts won't necessarily see payment plans as an enforceable right of the tenant once the moratorium lifts on August 1st. So even if you're a tenant and if you get a workout schedule with your landlord, what we're saying as a professional is saying that might not be enforceable in the court of law. So you kind of need to be careful on how that payment plan gets put together. And the article states, so even if you do work out a payment plan with your landlord, there's no legal guarantee that will be honored 60 days from now. So you've got the payment plan. This order goes through August 1st. After August 1st, how's that going to work out? We don't know. All right, so the proclamation also doesn't provide for what tenants with no income are supposed to do. Witter said, business closures due to COVID-19 have hit undocumented immigrants and others who fall through the cracks of the unemployment system especially hard, with some landlords reportedly trying to push out immigrants who can't pay. I understand that one. What about you've got tenants who are not paying and you are a landlord and you are depending upon that income for your livelihood? That is the way you make your money. A lot of landlords pay down their rental properties throughout the course of their working career and then use that income at the end of their working history to live. So what happens to landlords with all these rent moratoriums and restrictions? That's the flip side that I think a lot of people haven't answered. And the quick answer to that is tenants typically say, and tenant representatives say, well, they can get a mortgage forbearance. Well, that's not typically true. If you've got a mortgage on your property and you have a mortgage, if you've got a mortgage on your property and it is an investment property, the mortgage company typically doesn't offer forbearance on investment properties. It just doesn't happen. It's typically only on owner-occupied mortgages that forbearances are happening. So to make the argument, well, the landlord can just get a forbearance on their mortgage, that's not an accurate description of what's going on. And I understand what's happening with the eviction moratorium. We're trying to keep people in place that are in jeopardy of losing the roof over their heads. But it kind of goes both ways, doesn't it? You've got to look out for the landlord's rights as well to some extent. And most of the stuff that I've seen here has been extremely one-sided in the state of Washington to protect the tenant. A lot of people say, well, that's because tenants have less rights. And actually now in the state of Washington, specifically in the city of Seattle, tenants have way more rights than landlords, and that's just kind of the way it is. And I'll kind of get at the end of this podcast, I'll kind of tell you what I think is going to happen based on all of these circumstances going on. While the eviction moratorium helps keep many people off the street for now, housing advocates have been sounding the alarm and speaking with increasing intensity about the wave or avalanche, depending on who you ask, of evictions that will hit communities, particularly communities of color, once this order lifts or loses a potential court challenge. After all, the moratorium doesn't cancel rent. Tenants still owe tons of back rent that they'll likely will not be able to pay after August, especially if congressional or state lawmakers don't pass any more stimulus legislation. I kind of think that our stimulus legislation is pretty much done. If you are expecting the government to hand out to you a bunch of money so that you can keep up on your rent, I think we're kind of done with all that and we'll move forward. Is there one more federal stimulus package that's going to happen? Yeah, I think that is kind of back burner right now with all the protests going on and everybody's kind of just in this freak out mode of not quite sure what to do or what's going on. There's a lot of pause to a lot of the activities going on, especially legislature-wise, because we're in this state of what are we doing? All right, so Washington Community Action Network Communications Director Eric Fenner said the organization is relieved to have more time to push for tenant protections needed to prevent the inevitable wave of evictions, but expresses concern about whether state and local politicians will find the spine to enact them. So these moratoriums are great, but unless the court enforces them, they're kind of not really worth the cost of the paper that they're printed on, right? It just doesn't matter. If they're not enforceable, if they're not going to be enforceable in court, nobody cares. And we haven't really had enough time to figure out if these things are enforceable. We saw the one example where the landlord was required to pay back $300,000, but that's on a massive scale basis. On an individual one-on-one basis with landlord and tenants, we just haven't had a lot of time in history to see how all this is going to go down. And we're kind of reacting right now to the economy being shut down. And as the economy slowly kind of gets reopened, a lot of these issues, I think, kind of get pushed to the side and we just go on living how we go on living. And I think people are going to have to battle out what they're, doing on an individual basis. So Fenner is the Washington Community Action Network Communications Director. Fenner is calling for statewide just cause protections, which would force landlords to give tenants a good reason for evicting them. Not just you haven't paid your rent, got to have a good reason. Right now, landlords in most cities across the state can serve renters a 20-day notice for any reason they want. That's true. Lawmakers in Olympia failed to pass just cause protections last session, despite strong Democratic majorities and high levels of popular support. Fenner and other housing advocates also want to see the eviction ban for non-payment of rent made permanent. Payment plans aren't going to cut it. Rent relief is great, but the politicians are not going to get the money to cover the amount needed. So we have to make sure that people who are stable in their homes while we're finding those other solutions in the meantime. Otherwise, we're going to see a wave, she said. Yeah, and I think you will see a wave of evictions afterwards that we probably can't avoid. And I think a lot of this is trying to come up with reasonable solutions to mitigate that wave. But when you've shut down an economy and you have a lot of people who can't pay, guess what? There's a lot of collateral damage going on, and that's what's happening right now. So if you are a tenant and you can find a way to pay, it's probably in your best interest to go ahead and pay, because that rent is just going to add up. And if your landlord has to take you to court over a pretty good sized chunk of change, it's going to be in their interest to do so. So if there's a way that you can make your rent, that's what I recommend. Same thing on property owners, is if there's a way you don't want to go, if there's a way you can avoid mortgage forbearance on your owner-occupied property, take that route. You're going to save yourself a ton of headache down the road. Even if you have the ability to kind of tack that on to the end of your mortgage and it doesn't appear right now that anything's really going to impact you, make those payments, even if it's a massive struggle. You signed the commitment to make that mortgage, and tenants, you guys signed a legal contract in your written rental agreement. Make those payments if you can. If you can't, by then all means, contact your landlord, let them know. And that's what a lot of the wording in this most recent update is that we want the landlords to work with the tenants to figure it out, because there's a lot of situations where people can't make their rent, and I totally understand that. There's a lot of reasons where property owners can't make their mortgage payments because they're out of a job. They might not have the savings to make that go. So I think everybody's, for the most part, trying to do the best they can, but here's what I see with all of this moratorium that basically favors tenants. You're going to have fewer and fewer landlords that want to keep rental properties in the state of Washington. That is the bottom line, especially in Seattle. You've got a situation where there is super low supply of housing. Landlords can take their property and basically put the property on an as-is condition in Seattle. And if it's in a decent neighborhood, they put it on at market value. Guess what's going to happen? It is going to get ratcheted up in a price escalation war. You're going to have a bidding war. We're seeing that left and right. So I've kind of predicted this scenario now since the beginning of before the pandemic hit. I've been like, hey, there's minimal inventory. And we've gone into a case where there's even less inventory now. You got historically low interest rates. Did an entire podcast on that yesterday. You can check that out if you want, if you care. But low supply, low interest rates, and big demand. So you've got demand for housing. So all these rental houses that landlords no longer want to deal with because they've got such onerous restrictions on them as far as the eviction moratoriums, you've got landlords that are going to take the time, they're going to cash out. They're going to say, I am getting top dollar for my property. I no longer want to deal with these hassles of being a landlord in the state of Washington. That is what's going to happen. And then when you have even fewer rental units in the state of Washington, particularly in Seattle, guess what happens to rental prices? Yep, they go up. And that is what you're going to see. You're going to see the cost of living in Seattle go up substantially. You've already seen the cost of housing go up substantially, and rent has already gone up. But I think specifically you're going to see rent go up even more because you're going to have fewer and fewer rental properties in the pool of rental housing. We've already got a massive shortage of housing, period, let alone rental housing. There just isn't enough multifamily being built to cover all the needs of the housing market. Rent is so expensive already, but it's going to go up. And so that's kind of just where we're at. So it's great to have these moratoriums in place right now during the coronavirus, but on the other end, people got to pay their rent. They got to get back to kind of square one, get things evened up, because otherwise you're going to see even more pressure on the rental stock. And that's a real imbalance. And this is not an imbalance that we're seeing just in Seattle. You see that in every major metropolitan city, particularly the ones that have a lot of tech industry. You'll see it not so much in Los Angeles because they've got kind of a bigger stock, but housing prices there have gone through the roof. Specifically, you'll see it in New York. You'll see it in San Francisco. You see it in London. You see it in Sydney. And I know I'm going international here, but the dynamics are the same. Supply, demand, property prices, rental prices. They all kind of go hand in hand. And then you throw in super low interest rates in there. You've got buyers who are able to buy, takes out a lot of the stock of rental housing. And in the whole case of the price escalations that I'm talking about, you are not typically going to see landlords competing in there to buy a rental property with an escalation clause. Those are owner-occupied buyers. Those are people who want to live there. Their families are going to move there. They need housing. Those are the people that are typically bidding, whatever percentage over list price to get the property. If there's a bidding case, bidding war, we hear bidding wars all the time, up to maybe 20 offers come in. On the Summit Properties Northwest side and on the Reynolds and Klein side, we see it all the time. You'll see a list price and then you'll see a contract price way over that. And what you do is you contact the listing agent. Hey, was this a bidding war? Yeah, it was. Okay, that's why it got escalated up. Okay, how many offers did you have? All right, you had 14 offers. What kind of range did they escalate from and to? And that's kind of how that goes. And so we're able to track what's going on. And in the last couple of weeks, second half of May, I would say, you've seen a lot of bidding wars, and that is literally driving prices up despite the pandemic. So I've done a podcast on that as well, so you can check that out. All these factors work together, but what you're going to see is you're going to see a pretty dramatic increase in rent prices, I believe. So that is where we sit right now. So if you're a tenant, keep in mind, the eviction moratorium goes through August 1. Keep that kind of in the back of your head. If you can pay your rent, great. If you can't, call your landlord. That's the first step. Figure out a game plan. All right. Again, I'm Sean Reynolds from Summit Properties Northwest, Reynolds and Klein Appraisal. For those of you watching on YouTube, if you find this content helpful to your real estate career, or your ownership of real estate property, or whatever it is that you came to watch me on, love to have you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Love to have you hit the like button for this video and hit the notification bell so that each time that we bring out content, you'll get notified. And for those of you downloading us on our podcast platforms, thank you so much for tuning in. Again, I'm Sean Reynolds. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you'll know when our next video is out.